Hello, welcome to Critical Thinkers webinar on building resilience and improving wellbeing in schools. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Vicky Heath and I'm the Programme Director here at Critical Thinkers. Just a little bit about us before we begin. So Critical Thinkers is a social enterprise with the mission of empowering the next generation in becoming the more resilient, emotional, intelligent and in turn more effective critical thinkers. We are a fast-growing team of psychologists, educational specialists and social entrepreneurs. So this webinar today will explore resilience and wellbeing and will offer solutions to how we can improve them. So diving straight in. So I'm very excited to introduce you to our panel of experts. Karen Caulfield is Director at Critical Thinkers and has over 20 years experience as an assistant head teacher, pastoral deputy and newly qualified teacher mentor. Karen has authored a number of articles on the importance of pastoral education, as well as delivering a variety of webinars, teacher CPD and presentations. Gillian Shotton has over 23 years experience working as an educational psychologist. Over that time, she has written a number of books and articles focused on supporting emotional wellbeing. She is a field tutor on the doctoral course in educational psychology at Newcastle University and a member of the editorial board of the journal Educational Psychology in Practice. David Nightingale is a qualified consultant clinical psychologist that has spent 25 years assisting clients in attaining more positive mental health. More recently, he has focused on coaching as a means of enhancing performance. Sean O'Connell has enjoyed a successful career in professional rugby and now sits on the committee of the British Psychological Society and is responsible for promoting excellence in psychology for its members. And he now works with a number of schools and organisations to help develop their resilience and emotional intelligence, in addition to sharing strategies that underpin high performance. And finally, Ruth Sequeira is a BA MBA registered mindfulness teacher and supervisor and is a BACP accredited psychological therapist who has worked in CALMS, the education sector and privately for over 15 years. Welcome everyone and thank you for being with us today. So during the session, I have a few questions I'd like to ask our experts, then we'll have a chance to answer any relevant questions our viewers might have on the subjects we've covered. So those watching the webinar, please do type any questions you may have during the presentation into the YouTube live chat. Okay, so my first question is for you, Karen. Karen, what do we actually mean by resilience and why do you think it matters?
Well, I think that's a really interesting sort of like topic to start off with, and it's something that we've discussed quite a bit because I know that when I was a teacher and an NQT mentor and a deputy head, quite often I would say to the teachers, you know, what do we mean by resilience? And they said, well, they just need to be tougher and they need to have this mental toughness. And I think, you know, it's so important that we understand that there's quite a big difference between being resilient and being mentally tough. Psychology today actually sort of, it describes resilience. It's quite a long-winded description, but kind of says it's a quality that allows people to be knocked down, to go through bad times, but actually to come back stronger than ever. And rather than allowing that failure, that knockback to sort of like overcome them and drain sort of like all their energy and their resolve, it actually gives them a way to sort of like rise up and be stronger than ever. So bottom line, it means sort of bouncing back. And I kind of describe this to teachers a little bit like the Tigger effect. We want them to be bouncy. We know that they're going to have tough times. We want them to sort of like be resilient in terms of facing disappointment, facing failure, facing defeat. But instead of allowing that to sort of like keep us down and wallowing and being unhappy all the time, it's actually, yeah, this is where we are, but actually we're going to get back up and we're going to continue with what we need to do. You know, like I said, frequently it's quite interchangeable, you know, this mental toughness. And, you know, and that is something that I think historically it has been associated with resilience. So I just want to quickly look at the difference between the two, really, because mental toughness is more like a personality trait. It allows us to how to sort of like we deal with challenges on the day-to-day basis. That's when we want them to be tough. You know, in many ways, it's a little bit about being a bit hardy, sort of like quite optimistic towards challenge and risk. A lot of it's to do with confidence, actually, and I know we are going to talk about confidence and self-esteem maybe in some sort of like other webinars, but that's really what sort of like people take in their stride, and that is what that toughness is, what they can gain and learn from the experience. And I do find that sort of like most mentally tough individuals are quite resilient, but not all resilient people are mentally tough. And there's been quite a lot of research on that that I've been reading over the last sort of like couple of months. You know, those who are mentally tough, they're not only able to bounce back, but actually they can, you know, deal with that day-to-day challenge. So that's kind of the difference between the two. But bottom line, resilience is not just about being mentally tough. It's actually about how we come back from tough things and about how we come back day to day. Why it matters, I don't think it matters sort of like any more importantly, you know, it's so important now that our students and we actually are resilient, and we hear particularly a lot about growing and developing resilience, you know, for a very good reason, actually, and it's a great trait to have. There's so much evidence that being resilient helps with improved and greater academic achievement. It also shows a great pastoral achievement, and obviously I am a pastoral sort of like specialist, and it's at the heart of everything I do. And I think kids who are resilient and adults are resilient actually are better in terms of their well-being. They're able to accept where they are now, but also be able to bounce back as well. We tend to find that they make better choices, people who are resilient. So if we're looking at a 16, 17, 18-year-old, their choices tend to be more informed, sort of more positive in many ways, and they're able to stand up against the crowd, stand up against peer pressure, and just make better, more healthy choices as well. We tend to find that they're more involved in the community and within their family relationships as well. And as we know, sort of resilience really helps with physical health as well. So if we combine the mental and the physical health, that is really important. So that's kind of what I think is so important, that we have this understanding that it's not just about mentally toughness. It's not about being strong every day. It's actually about allowing tough things to happen and having the ability to bounce back. So, yeah, great question. Sorry, very long-winded answer, but
yeah, no, that was just really interesting. Yeah, I was just thinking about whether you have to have kind of, you know, adversity in your life to be able to become resilient, but you're saying that it's not really, that's not really the place that it always has to come from.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people do have a lot of adversity going through their lives. They really do, and they think, you know, come on, and they say, oh, it's character building, and yes, in many ways it is, but on the other hand, you don't always have to have adversity to have great resilience. You know, it is something that you can develop over time as well. So.
Wonderful, thanks, Karen. That actually leads us nicely on to our next question, which I have for Sean, if that's okay, Sean. So then why does resilience vary from person to person?
Yeah, so I think Karen was spot on with some of her points, and in particularly resilience being that ability to endure and bounce back quickly from stress. And I think it's that key component of how do individuals deal with stress that's really important. And if you look at any individual difference, there's always genetic and environmental factors. So in terms of looking at resilience, what we're looking at is how sensitive are people to stress? You know, some people can endure lots of stress and it not make too big a difference for them, whereas others find stress very stressful. So essentially there's areas of the brain, so our emotional processing areas like the amygdala. Some people just genetically have more sensitive amygdalas, which is part of that stress fight or flight response. So it's almost, it's triggered more easily. So they experience that stressful state at a more intense level. But there's almost also some really important developmental processes. A lot of it is in terms of social modeling. So for example, a lot of children will learn from their peers, from their parents, from those around them. And we can learn strategies. You know, resilience really, it is a skill. It's something that can be learned and developed. And learning these cognitive techniques or these various different strategies to cope with stress, to reappraise stress. And there's some amazing research in terms of how we think of stress. Is stress something to be feared, or is it a challenge we should move towards and try and deal with? In terms of how we develop resilience, we almost have this sort of Goldilocks effect of, if you imagine the three porridges, if we don't get enough challenges in our life, we don't develop the internal resources to deal with stress. If we have, you know, too much stress in our life, we become overwhelmed. And when we become overwhelmed, we release cortisol in the brain. It's our stress hormone. And particularly in developing brains, you know, in young people, stress and cortisol in particular is really damaging to areas of the brain like the amygdala, like the hippocampus. So really important in terms of emotional regulation, but also in terms of learning and behavior. So we had these two factors in terms of the environmental and the genetic. And what was really interesting is even within those people who have experienced stressful, traumatic, you know, really abusive upbringings, we still see variation in terms of those who are, you know, suffer from, you know, negative psychological outcomes, addiction, all those sorts of issues, poor mental health, depression. But we see another group who experience, you know, equally maltreatment and poor environments that grow up in, and they're fine. And what's interesting is there's no difference in terms of the structure of the brain. You know, they did studies looking at the amygdala size, the hippocampus, and both were equally effective. But what they found was there was a difference in terms of the function of the brain as a network, in particular, the ability for the brain to connect with different hubs in the brain, and that prefrontal cortex, the sort of front rational part of the brain, in those who experienced trauma but were able to successfully come through it. They found that the prefrontal cortex was really able to support that network. And what that does is it gives a bigger bandwidth to be able to tolerate and compensate for challenge. And what's really interesting is this network, this brain network of resilience, it's a multifaceted system, which is driven by our physiology, our neurobiology, our psychology, and also our biosocial, so our social relationships. So we four really key levers that we can learn to leverage to become more resilient. And I think what's really nice is it's a dynamic model. You know, we all have people who are incredibly resilient, but we have bad days. And, you know, sometimes the day just gets on top of us. And when we understand it's that model, and when we're able to understand, you know, for example, what's my internal biochemistry like today? How did I sleep? You know, what's my nutrition like? All these different elements drive our ability, they drive our well-being and our resilience, which gives us that outcome to be able to deal with stress or not deal with stress. So I think that's a really key element in terms of looking at what can we do to increase that skill of resilience? How can we give you know, young people the tools they need to be able to grow? And I think that's the key point of why resilience is important. Is firstly, we can't control the challenges that life places on us. But secondly, in order for us to develop, going back to that Goldilocks analogy, we need to be able to deal with certain amounts of stress in order to grow. We need to be able to get out of our comfort zone. And if we're not resilient enough to get out of our comfort zone, we'll never grow and develop. So in terms of creating young students who can go forward into the world and not fear failure, resilience is a huge part of underpinning that.
That's great. Thanks, Sean. Just while you were speaking, I was just thinking, so is it fair to say then that people that are maybe more resilient also are able to understand that they're going through a moment of stress? So they can reflect on what's happening in their body in the real moment. Is that? Yeah,
absolutely. There's a fantastic strategy called metacognition. Right. And what metacognition is being able to challenge your thoughts that you have. And an example of that is, I'm unhappy. Whereas metacognition is, I've noticed that I'm having the thought that I'm unhappy. And when you're able to implement metacognition, you're able to start viewing things more objectively, and you're able to challenge those thoughts. So instead of going, I'm angry, whose fault is it, who's upset me, you're able to say, okay, well, what's going on with me here? How did I sleep last night? Could it be my blood sugar's low? Have I had cumulative stresses in other areas of my life, and that's taking up that bandwidth? And it's a really important element of self-management, because we do only have a limited amount of bandwidth, and a lot of time, if people continue to load up, we end up overstressing ourselves. And if we continually do that, not only does it lead to burnout, but as Karen quite rightly said, it leads to those long-term implications for our mental health, particularly with cardiovascular health. And it changes something which is known as our allostatic load. And our allostatic load is actually how our body adapts to stress. We become more wired, and we all know those people who are sort of highly strung. It's their allostatic load has shifted, whereas you imagine the Zen Buddhist monk who spends all that time decompressing and recovering, they're calm, they're relaxed. So that self-management and that ability to recognize and challenge your own thoughts is an awesome tool to be able to improve resilience.
Thank you, Sean. Yeah, that's fantastic. Really interesting. Thank you. So moving on to the next question, actually. The third question is for Gillian. Gillian, can you tell us how can protective factors help build resilience?
Yeah, sure. So in this model that we've got here, represented the protective factors with shields, which are kind of like shielding the person from the slings and arrows that life throws at them. So on the left there, you've got the amount and intensity of stressful events, which are represented by those different arrows. And the more stressful events that a young person experiences, or any person experiences, then the more likely they are to fall down, really, and not be resilient in terms of that. Maybe exhibit symptoms of PTSD, depression, behavior problems. But we also know from research that decreasing that stockpile of stressful events, even just by one, can have a really profound effect on increasing resilience. And this is really useful to know, because sometimes, you can't change what's going on at home for a young person. You maybe can't change the fact that there's some alcoholism in the family, or there's other home factors. But maybe in school, there is another situation that the young person's finding stressful that you can change. So for one young person, he found going into a busy dining hall yet another stressor in his already very, very stressful life. But the staff were able to make alternative arrangements for him to eat in a different place. And that made a massive difference, just by decreasing his stockpile of slings and arrows, if you like, that were being fired at him, just by doing that one small thing in terms of his resilience. That was something that he said made a big difference. And I think that was one of the factors, was that he knew people cared about him as well. So just to run through these external protective factors, and then we'll talk a little bit about the internal protective factors as well, which Sean's already touched on, really. But there's lots of external protective factors that research has found is really important in shielding us and helping us to be more resilient if we've got these in our lives. So you'll probably be able to see from the diagram that the largest of these is relationships. And we know that the importance of early attachment relationships between the carer and child, there's loads of evidence now that shows that that's very well established. Advances in neuroscanning technology have confirmed that link between having a warm, caring relationship and the development of the brain. But maybe you know that a young person doesn't necessarily have that kind of quality of relationship at home. But it's important also to recognise that in school, relationships can be critical as well in terms of the resilience of the young person. And particularly as young people get older, the relationships that constitute our secure base expand. And certainly it's been my experience working in schools that the relationships that young people have, maybe with just one or two members of staff, have been like the most consistent and stable relationships that they've had across their lives, actually, and have made a huge difference. And I think about one young person who that had an absolutely appalling range of adverse experiences, but went on to get a very good honours degree in English. And the protective factors that she cited were her English teacher, who showed an interest in her, and a love of reading. So it's a bit of encouragement, I think, for school staff, because actually, you know, you may be involved with a young person in helping them to develop a love of books, or you may be a listening ear and have a really good relationship with them. And it's just to recognise that actually you can be playing a really critical factor in terms of being one of those shields for them in terms of their resilience, and helping them to be more resilient when those slings and arrows are coming at them. So we know as well that clubs and hobbies also represent external protective factors. They give the young person a chance to shine in a different environment, and also to be able to develop other relationships, which may be key for them as well. And I think we can all relate to how key friendships are when we're going through rough periods, and how important it is just to have a circle of friends around us and people to talk to that can really get us through those difficult times. So when considering how we can help young people, it's useful to look at what are those things, those external protective factors. How can we put those in place to help young people in the school environment? But also in terms of the internal protective factors as well. We know that there are a lot of different things that we can help students to learn with that are kind of going to help them in terms of their resilience from an internal perspective. So first of all, their level of emotional literacy. We know that being able to recognise and effectively express your emotions has been associated with greater resilience. Perseverance as well, the ability to keep going, either working towards outward goals or inner coping strategies, being action orientated, and trusting in the process and not giving up. There's also having an internal locus of control. And that's really the belief that you, rather than outside forces, have control in your life. And this is associated with less stress, because people who've got that internal locus of control can be more proactive in dealing with stresses in their lives, and more solution orientated, and feel a greater sense of control, which brings less stress. And then finally, as the final internal protective factor, we've got optimism, the ability to notice the positives in most situations. And that ability can help to shift how you handle problems, going from kind of a victim mentality to an empowered one, and then more choices open up. And one way to really help to develop that optimism is through gratitude. And I'm going to be talking about that later on in the practical strategies bit. But certainly there's been masses of studies now that have shown the link between gratitude and resilience and emotional well-being. So there's lots of evidence in that quarter now, which is really helpful for us.
Thank you, Gillian. That's really helpful. And it's just lovely to hear about relationships being such a key factor for young people, because I think sometimes it can get overwhelming, can't it, with teachers doing so much, and going back to that basic need of just being heard and being seen and being cared about is so vitally important to everything we're talking about today. So thank you very much. We're going to move on now to our fourth question, if that's okay. David, if we could move to you. How do we develop our mental strength to promote more positive well-being?
Okay, I think initially it's worth mentioning that mental strength and mental well-being are kind of interlinked, whereby there's a positive correlation, I believe, between the two. So if we're high on mental strength, it tends to be conducive to better mental well-being. There are various mechanisms through which we can seek to improve mental strength and mental well-being, including education to facilitate improvements in the 4 areas mentioned on the slide. So focus, what we choose to focus on; self-talk, which is essentially what we choose to say to ourselves and how we interpret things; behavioral choices, what we choose to do; and also trying to develop useful ways of viewing and understanding things. Regarding the latter, I'd like you to think about your life in terms of this representation. The representation is essentially a way of conceptualizing your time. There are 3 stages. There's the past, present, and future. The green boxes represent moments in your life, spanning maybe a couple of seconds. Now, what we can see from the diagram is that moments move along the conveyor belt from the near future to the point of arriving briefly in the now, and then quickly falling into what I've described as the bin of the past. The bin of the past in this conceptualization is essentially every moment that's occurred in your life up until this point. At the other end of the conveyor belt, on the floor, we've got a massive pile of boxes or moments. And these represent the moments that are so far unlived, in a sense, the total of your future ahead. And these arrive and are placed on the conveyor belt one at a time for the rest of your life. A lot of the problems in life can often arise, I don't know if I can have the next slide, from essentially over-focusing on the past. It can be a bit like in the top picture, driving a car whilst being fixated on the rear view mirror, which is not a particularly effective way to travel. Without a time machine, the past is uncontrollable. And so that is, in essence, we can't change moments that have already gone. And psychological science tells us that if we focus on uncontrollable things excessively, it lowers mood, and also we tend to be less effective. Moving down to the second picture, another challenge is that the brain is prone to excessively worry about what might happen. Again, in terms of the picture, perhaps a bit like trying to drive whilst viewing through binoculars, looking out for danger in the distance. So our mind essentially often thinks of many possible ways that things might go wrong. The reason why this is not typically a good use of our time is that typically maybe about 90% or more of the things that we think that we worry about happening either don't happen at all or don't happen in the precise way that we worry about them happening. So it's not a good use of our time. I don't know if I could have the next slide. So in the top picture, another way to think about this moments model that I'm putting forward is to conceptualize moments as essentially blank canvases. So we see here that you are the artist painting on the blank canvas the present moment that is in front of you now. Our life tends to work better if our main focus and energy is on creating on this blank canvas the present moment in front of us, rather than entrenched in the bin of the past or overthinking the future. And then on to the second picture. Essentially, if we look at this model, mentally we often try to use a time machine to either travel back into our past excessively or fly into a future unwritten. Life tends to work better if we focus more on the now, squeezing all we can from the moments that are right in front of us in the present. I don't know if I could just have the next slide. So we can extend and broaden this to sort of a pragmatic problem-solving representation. And the diagram essentially reflects a shorthand formula for approaching problems. When a problem or challenge emerges for us, a key question, a really crucial question is, can I control or influence this? And if the answer to that is no, like something that's in the bin of the past and has happened years ago, or it's some abstract, remote, unlikely possibility in the future, then if we can't really control or influence it, then it's better to refocus on something we can control. And if the answer to that question, can I control this, is yes, then what follows on could be sort of standard problem-solving strategy, which is outlined on on the slide. I don't know if I could just move on to the final slide. So finally, we all view the world through our own idiosyncratic meaning networks or templates, as represented by glasses on the representation. A lot of work that I do is trying to help people to develop meaning networks or templates that assist in making their lives work better. The importance of the template through which we use the world in terms of affecting resilience or affecting mental well-being is absolutely pivotal. And Beveridge is quoted as saying, "We're prone to see what lies behind our eyes rather than what appears before them." Or to quote from Barash, "Very often implications like beauty or ugliness are so often in the eyes of the beholder." So essentially, if we can helpfully change aspects of the lens through which we view the world, then our lives tend to work better. And for me, therein lies great educational possibility to make huge contributions to people's lives.
Thanks, David. That's fantastic. I love that focus on what you can control and not what you can't. You can't control. I think that's, I guess, when you're in the middle of being stressed and upset about something, having that just as a script, a self-regulation script would be really helpful, wouldn't it, in those moments, if we remember them.
That's right. And it's like any skill, through practice and through changing the way we look at the world and approach things, we can get better and better and better at it. It's not sort of an all or none feature. It's better conceptualized on a continuum where we can move up in a positive direction.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It moves us nicely on to the next question, actually, when you were talking about being in the appreciating the present and the now. So we move on to question 5, which is for Ruth. How can we manage our emotions and minds to support well-being?
Yeah, great. Thank you. So, yeah, I guess most of us as adults, and definitely for me, I can say during my education as a young person, I got very little education into actually how to manage my kind of internal life. So, yeah, I work with groups of adults, and some of the kind of practices we do are looking at how people relate to their feelings, how the thoughts come along, what starts to happen to us when we get stressed, when things go a bit pear-shaped in our lives, when we get anxious. And really commonly adults will say to me, "Why did nobody tell me this stuff when I was young?" And so it sometimes feels like, I don't know, like we all walk around with a bit of a mask of everything's fine. And so we grow up thinking that everybody else is doing fine, and actually it's only for me that's got these kind of negative thinking patterns going on, that can be self-critical at times, that can sometimes find stresses that other people seem to be fine just kind of devastating. And actually this is part of our sort of common humanity, to struggle at times and to kind of have some of that kind of negative thinking going on. And it's really helpful to actually know, yeah, this is a common experience rather than a personal failing. So yeah, just this kind of that Sean talked about, that the metacognitive awareness, so that awareness of what we're thinking and the awareness of what we're feeling, and then from that awareness we can then kind of develop ways of responding to that are helpful. So if we're not even aware that we're stressed, we tend to move into this reactivity, whereas if we're aware that we're stressed, we can kind of support ourselves and respond in kind of wiser ways a lot of the time. So yeah, we quite often go through our lives in this kind of autopilot where we're really unaware of what our minds are doing, and quite often unaware of how we're feeling. So this means that we can really miss out on what's happening right now. So we can kind of, yeah, even be in beautiful surroundings out in nature, but our mind is thinking about that stressy work meeting that we had this morning, or difficult conversation that we've got coming up, or plans for tomorrow. And actually we really miss out on the beauty of what can be happening right now. Or we can just spend so much of our time either in the future, that kind of pre-living, or the reliving, as David was just talking about, the kind of past or the future. And when we're unaware of what we're thinking and what we're feeling, we don't catch those things that our mind do, with kind of creating stress for ourselves, of creating anxiety for ourselves, with all the kind of chatter that goes on in our minds. So yeah, that the kind of awareness, I think, is the first place to start in terms of managing our emotions and well-being. So yeah, I guess schools can be sort of really pressured environments, and both for staff and for young people, and this kind of, yeah, the supporting young people to be aware of that, and to kind of know when stress is getting too much, and how to manage those, and to kind of yeah, within the pressure, within the busyness of lives, to take some pauses. We need some kind of downtime in order to bring out our own creativity and to kind of reduce stress levels. So just taking pauses in the day to kind of, yeah, focus on our own well-being can be really helpful.
Thanks, Ruth. Yeah, I loved it when you said that you know, young people always think that no one else is going through these kind of things. And I think that's so important, isn't it? Just the recognition that it's fine to be where you're at, and it's being, I guess, as Sean was mentioning as well, it's being self-reflective about where you are as well, and recognizing those, and recognizing what is this emotion that's coming up, and just that's fine to feel it, I think.
Yeah, and I think that with that comes it's more likely to come a sense of self-compassion, rather than beating ourselves up around how we're feeling or our perceived failings, yeah, which we can too often do, and it's really unhelpful to do that. It just kind of beats us down further when we're already feeling a bit low, when we get into that kind of thinking, rather than actually having some time for self-care to kind of, which will actually support us to be more resilient.
Yeah, thanks, Ruth. Yeah, I was just thinking, you mentioned a good strategy there, just taking a breath and taking a pause, you know, and I thought it might be really helpful if we, for the people watching, if we discuss some more practical strategies and solutions that we can use to help build resilience and improve wellbeing in schools. So I'll go around to each of you if that's okay, and just ask for some suggestions. So Karen, can I start with you?
Yeah, of course. And it was really interesting because I did some work with the school last week, actually, and I do a programme about sort of like being outdoors and being that teacher champion, which Gillian focused on so brilliantly, about how you can be that teacher that makes just a massive, massive difference. And it's actually one of the reasons why I love to teach, actually, is because I do quite thrive on being that teacher champion, but I also know that it makes such a huge difference to the young children and to, you know, the young adults and everything. It can be that massive thing that just helps them through the day. But the work that I was doing last week was it was a program called Walking on Sunshine, and luckily last week we did have lots of sunshine. It was really, really cold, but I worked with a group of teachers, and luckily an SLT member, which kind of helped because they were happy to integrate the scheme, and we looked at some of the lessons and we sort of said, right, let's try and get these kids outside. The particular school that I was working with had a small courtyard and a car park. That was it. So they don't have huge playing fields or anything like that where they can go and find and sit under a tree or something like that. And we were looking at some of the lessons and we were saying, how can we get these children outside? Because there is so much evidence, and really new evidence actually, and research on the benefits of getting the students outside. I was recently reading something that was saying that if you listen to a podcast or a recording or someone talking whilst you are walking outside, your memory increases by over 60%. So you have the ability to retain those facts 60% more than you would if you were sat quite sort of like passively inside a classroom. And there's something to do with being outside and moving. So one of the lessons that happened this week was the Battle of Hastings in the courtyard. So they were running around in this small courtyard, sort of like reenacting the Battle of Hastings. And then we had a poetry lesson in the car park. So the teacher read the poem. They sat on the curb. I've got pictures, it's incredible. They sat on the curbs where the car was, and then they wrote their own poems based on what feel, because it was cold, because obviously the wind is coming from the north, so it's a little bit cold at the moment, and just the most amazing sort of like feedback from the students, who just thought that it was the best week ever. Their work was really good, and then they had an assembly this afternoon where they asked for feedback, And these students just loved it, absolutely loved it. And so I would really encourage, where you can, even if you've got the smallest amount of space, to just try and implement some sort of outdoor sort of like work. Or even if when you're setting homework, say, go and read outside, or go and draw something outside, because the benefits of being outdoors are just incredible, and so good for their mental health, for their well-being, and ultimately their resilience, because they might get wet, but you know what, they'll get dry again. It's absolutely fine. And if they're going for a walk, they might get muddy shoes, but you know what, everything's washable. It's all fine. And I think that would be the one thing, especially at the moment with the weather the way it is. You know, get those students outside, because you will really see such a majorly positive impact on their whole demeanour. So that's my little strategy for this week.
That's fantastic. I've written that down about the memory walking with the podcast, so that's good.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's great. Sean, have you got anything to share about some practical strategies to try with young people or teachers? Or
Yeah. So I had one, but I've actually, having sort of listened to what people are saying, I think there's another really important element of it. And I think to be able to develop that self-awareness, that's the first starting point. I think as soon as we're able to challenge what's happening to us, why are we feeling the way we are, we give ourselves a much better opportunity to actually create an intervention at that point. So, you know, approximately 95% of our thoughts, our behavior, it's subconscious. So we fall into those patterns like David described earlier, where we go into that automatic thinking. And if we have some maladaptive thoughts, so for example, if a student, you know, doesn't do well in a maths exam, it could be, you know, I'm just not good at maths. But if we're able to, at that point, you know, hit the pause button and go, actually, hold on, let me like reappraise this, let me think what's going on. And whether that's a maths exam or, you know, emotional response to a situation, that ability to hit that pause button allows us then to figure out, okay, well, you know, what's going on? Like, how am I feeling? Why am I feeling this way? And when you understand why you're feeling the way you are, when you understand the mechanisms, you know, what's going on internally that makes you feel this way, it gives you an element of control. And at that point, you can start to apply the knowledge and understanding to get yourself out of that. A lot of our behavior is just governed by our internal biochemistry, our internal states. You know, as David used the fantastic analogy of the glasses, it's like our glasses, they change depending on how we're doing internally. If anyone's ever had a cold or has been feeling under the weather, we get a slight tint on our glasses where the day seems a bit gloomier. Whereas if we're feeling really positive, we've slept well, we've exercised, we've got outside, as Karen has said, you know, we've got the shades, and all of a sudden life's great. So I think being able to develop that self-awareness, to be able to hit the pause button and say, okay, you know, why am I feeling like this? And then to have the solutions and the understanding and knowledge to then get back into that position from, you know, I'm not doing as well as I could be, to actually, here we go, I'm back on track and I'm ready to thrive again. I think that's what's really exciting, is by teaching students this at such a young age, we can completely change their developmental trajectory. We can give them the tools to go from, you know, just sort of plodding along and picking up things as they go, to actually having a really robust skill set that they can apply in any situation. And, you know, it's hugely exciting to think, what will society be like in 10 years time if we've, you know, 15-year-olds or younger or any age learning these skills. So that would definitely be one point. And I think the second point I'd add is to try and create meaning out of the things that happen to us, and the meaning we create out of the events of our life. It can either be what's known as adaptive or maladaptive. So we can either go, you know, this thing happened to me because I'm not good enough, or it can be, this thing happened to me which tells me I need to learn these skills, or I need to improve in these areas. And once I do that, then I'll be good enough to progress. And it's the narrative that we give to the events in our lives which determine which sort of path we take. Do we end up on a negative path where we don't try again? Or do we, you know, encourage ourselves to go back onto that positive path? And I know we'll mention growth mindset a little bit later, but that's obviously a huge part of that, is being able to get ourselves back onto that positive path. So that would probably be another tip.
great, thanks, Sean. That's really helpful. Moving on to you, Gillian. Have anything you'd like to share?
Yes. Well, I gave a little teaser earlier on when I talked about gratitude, and it's going back to what Sean said and what Karen said as well, is just having that awareness that actually these are skills and tools that we can teach and share with the young people. Because some people sort of tend to think, oh, I'm just a pessimistic person, that's the way I am, and I can't change. And I know we're going to talk about growth mindset in a little bit, but actually giving them the tools to be able to develop enables them to be able to become more optimistic and to look at things differently. And that's kind of what I wanted to focus on with gratitude. And there's been a lot of research that's shown that just journaling for about 5 minutes a day about what we're grateful for can really enhance long-term happiness, as well as improve self-esteem and self-perception, can help you feel better about your circumstances. And there's also been some research that's shown that it has an impact in terms of people coping with suicidal thoughts as well in stressed and very depressed individuals. So it's I think it's something that's good for everyone. And it's something that I've done quite a lot in my life, is to have like a little journal at the end of the day and just write down 3 things that I'm grateful for that day. But it's something that you can put into place in schools as well as a little practice to do at the end of the day, or maybe as part of the lesson. And just within that, I thought it might be nice for us to take a moment just now on this Friday afternoon, and just to settle ourselves wherever you are, in your chair, maybe at home or at school or wherever you are, and to take a little moment just for you to kind of think about something or someone that you're very grateful for. And just to hold that person in your mind. And it might be that it's a pet, it might be that it's a place, but just to have a little thought about what it is that that person brings into your life, and what it is that you appreciate about them. And just to give yourself a little moment to do that, to hold them there. And then to come back to being with us right now. It only took about 30 seconds, but actually can make a significant difference in terms of feelings that we have, that it brings about with us, and our mindset at that particular point in time. So that's my little end of practical strategies bit.
That's lovely. Thanks, Gillian. It just reminded me of something my daughter brought home today, which was Daisy's complimentary card. And they do it for each of the children. In each day is different. And I think they do it maybe over certain weeks in the term. But everybody wrote down in her class something they think is amazing about my daughter.
Oh, lovely.
And there's something psychologically about seeing that written down makes it real for children, I think, as you were saying earlier, that the journal and looking at that, you know, the concrete evidence of it. It's not abstract anymore, it's actually written. And someone took the time to formulate that sentence and put it on her card. And honestly, she came in, she was absolutely just that one thing. And that can't have taken too long. But it's such a simple thing to implement in school. Yeah, that's really lovely. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. David, could we move on to you?
Thanks very much, Vicky. I really enjoyed that, Gillian. That was very powerful.
And it's nice pause, as Ruth was saying. It's
so I was thinking a bit about self-talk and focus. Sean covered self-talk really, really well. And I think it is a very powerful area where loosely, things mean what we make them mean. And when we develop increased insight, increased awareness, then we can develop better meanings. We can choose better meanings, sometimes through concrete examples, through metaphors. We can see the value of making different choices in terms of what we make things mean, because often things are ambiguous and they can mean more than one thing. So why not choose something that helps us more in our life rather than something that makes our life work less well? But I was going to sort of simplify things in terms of focus, really, rather than self-talk, and just talk about 4 areas of focus. And the notion that if we can make 4 focus switches in our life, then generally our life will go better. And so the first one is spending more time focusing on what's controllable, or at least can be influenced, and less time focusing on what is uncontrollable. And we talked a bit about that earlier in terms of if we focus excessively on the uncontrollables, it lowers our mood, it tends to be ineffective. And again, it overlaps with the idea that when we excessively focus on the past, moments that are already gone, or we excessively worry about remote, unlikely possibilities in the future, we're kind of putting our energy into that which we can't control. And so making that one switch, and again, it's not an all or none, but if we put more of our energy into the controllables, it will tend to enhance our life. Switch 2 is very, very relevant at the moment with the coronavirus and the restrictions that we've been having for the past year. And that's kind of spending more time focusing on what we can do in the sense of the options that we do have, and less time focusing on what you can't do. And again, it can just give us that bit of extra momentum, sometimes, I guess, for example, a teenager, when the Wi-Fi goes down, is a real challenge. The Wi-Fi goes down for a few hours. How do we use that time? Is it all about the thing we can't necessarily control because there's some, fault with the provider or something, or is it more, what can I squeeze out of these moments? And developing that skill, one of the most important skills in life. I think there are many beautiful things in the world, but one of the most important skills is making the best out of things that aren't ideal. Because if we wait till things are ideal before we give of our best or squeeze the best out of things, then we'll spend most of our life waiting, and our life will be a fraction of what it could have been. We'll be a fraction of what we could have been. Switch 3 overlaps very nicely with what Gillian mentioned about gratitude, and the idea of counting our blessings almost. And it's spending more time focusing on what's right about your life and its possibilities, and less time dwelling on what's wrong in your life. And I think, as Gillian said, covered really, really well, that can give us momentum and it can help improve life quality. And finally, switch 4 is really, could we spend more time thinking about what could potentially go spectacularly well, and less time focusing on what might go spectacularly wrong? I think particularly in areas where our behavior can make a difference, belief that what we strive for can be achieved is huge. It can decrease anxiety. It can change in a positive way what we focus on and what we say to ourselves. And most important of all, coming back to sort of, resilience, mental strength, it can change how we deal with setbacks. And I think there's a quote from Henry Ford, which is, if you think you can or you think you can't, you're right.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you, David. And finally to Ruth, any practical strategies?
Yeah, I just want to give a little plug to looking after school staff, actually. So we're all social beings, and we've evolved to kind of live in groups, and as part of that we're really kind of reading each other all the time, and particularly looking out for signs of safety or signs of threat. And so a teacher holds, or school staff hold, very powerful positions in school. So when teachers are stressed, that kind of ripples out to the rest of the students, and it kind of creates this environment where things just feel a little bit less safe and less contained. And similarly, when teachers are feeling calm and in control and creative, that also ripples out. So self-care for teachers is just really, really important. And as humans, teachers will get stressed at times, so it's about kind of supporting teachers to manage those stresses, which might just include those little pauses in teaching life where things are getting stressful in the classroom, and this is when our kind of reactivity comes out and behavior gets faster, reactions get faster, and just taking a moment, and students don't need to know that you're doing this, but to just taking a moment to notice, what am I thinking right now? What am I telling myself right now about this situation? What am I feeling right now? And what's going on in my body right now? And then just taking, it can be half a minute just to kind of feel your feet on the ground, maybe connect with your breath, just noticing your breath moving in your belly, or kind of feeling the sensations in your hands, and something that kind of brings you away from that sort of chatter in their mind that will kind of trigger further stress for you, and just calms down the nervous system. Can then just help things go differently in the classroom, and slow down those reactions and really make a difference to how that interaction goes.
Lovely, thank you, Ruth. So we've come to the point where if any of our viewers have any questions regarding what's been discussed. There's one that came through earlier, actually, which you've kind of mentioned, everybody, was about growth mindset and how this is related to resilience and well-being. I don't know if any of you want to come in and flesh that out a little bit.
Yeah, I'd be happy to take that one, Vicky. Essentially, I guess to take a step back to understand, resilience and that stress relationship again, it's that our stress response is governed by our emotional processing areas, and they're very powerful, and they evolve to keep us safe in a dangerous environment. Our prefrontal cortex, our rational brain, developed much later in our evolutionary history. So in terms of its significance, it's far less powerful. So our emotions drive everything. But our prefrontal cortex can actually down-regulate our emotional response. And particularly when we're able to apply control over the situation or control over the stressor in MRI machines, you see that prefrontal cortex light up, down-regulate that emotional processing area. And the reason this relates to growth mindset is growth mindset, it attaches the value and the reward to the process rather than the outcome. And like David's mentioned, and it's been mentioned a few times, that ability to focus on the controllables, it's so important in terms of being able to actually have a different activation pathway in our brain, which makes us better able to down-regulate that emotional response. So yeah, growth mindset is huge, not only just for resilience, but in terms of how it makes us resilient. It's that ability to control the controllables, and that element of control changes our neural activity, activates the prefrontal cortex, down-regulates that emotional response. So yeah, really, really cool stuff.
What's the best way to kind of promote that within schools? This is to anybody on the panel here. Anything we can do to improve it within schools?
I'm happy to take that one again. If you think of it almost like an equation, and if you think, a maths equation, you've all the inputs on one side, the equal sign and the outcome. A lot of people, so for example, the outcome might be a grade. At the end of the year, they get an A or an A star in English. But it's about rewarding what are all the inputs that get people there? What are the values? What are the behaviors? And, it's things like hard work, perseverance. So when we create a growth mindset culture, we're rewarding those inputs rather than the outputs. So, it doesn't matter so much whether someone gets a B grade or a C grade or whatever it is. If they came from an E grade, that's a huge growth, that's huge improvement. And the reason they improved was because of that period spent with those inputs. And there's actually a lot of neuroscience around growth mindset. And essentially what it is when we focus on something, when we're engaged in a task, we get a buildup of a neurotransmitter called norepinephrine, which is discomfort in the brain. It's stressful, it pains the brains, but it signals the neurons. It almost acts like a highlighter. And when we sleep at night, that's what signals for the new neurons to grow. So actually being able to tell kids that learning is hard, it's uncomfortable, but it's that process which is actually helping us to improve. It's almost like if we're getting fitter, that period of running and that discomfort is what gets us fitter. And then kids are like, this is me doing it, this is me improving. And that itself is hugely motivating. So being able to educate as to what's going on and how it's helping them is really powerful.
Great.
And I'll just also chip in there, because I see it also as being really in terms of students coming to believe that they can change the way that they are as well. And that kind of level of neuroplasticity that the brain has, that we're not just going to be pessimists for the rest of our life because that's the way we are, but actually we can learn these skills. We can learn to manage our emotions better. We can get better at all of these different skills, and I think that's really important to emphasize. And I love that growth mindset emphasizes that it's like it's not just because you're bad at maths. You're not just bad at maths. We can all get better at all of these things.
Yeah, it's so important. I guess it goes back to the whole self-talk and self-regulation scripts that are really useful for young people, aren't they? Of just kind of reevaluating and reflecting on, why am I thinking I'm bad? I can change my thought processes to think, actually, no, I can do that. And I have a plan. This is my plan of how to reach that optimal goal of being a little bit better. And as Sean was saying, just feeling comfortable in that learning pit, where that's where you're learning, and making mistakes is all part of that. I think that's really important. Yeah, sorry, David.
Yeah, I was going to say, if I could just say a few bits and pieces about that. Growth, part of growth mindset really is how do we interpret setbacks, which we talked about with the self-talk, and how do we interpret not reaching a goal on any given occasion. And part of the way to work on that often is, and again overlapping with what Sean was saying, is to focus more on process than outcome. Mm-hmm. And the process is really almost like, how hard do we try to achieve our goals? How hard do we look for the right kind of strategies, kind of like application and direction? And so if we judge ourselves more on process than outcome, then it kind of reduces the extent to which we're derailed when things don't go as well. And so in that sense, we have there's greater persistence, we get derailed for less. And I think, I suppose ultimately, if we're studying and we got everything right every time, then that's great. It'd be very enjoyable, but we wouldn't really be learning anything because we've already mastered it. So almost trying to reinterpret the notion of not being able to do things or not getting to the standard, how we interpret discrepancies, where we're at a certain level, we want to get to this level, how we talk about and think about those things is very important. And the idea that, in a sense, any error, any occasion where we don't meet our targets is essentially flagging up an opportunity to learn and to get better, and almost seeing it in that way. And and as Sean says as well, maybe relabeling some of the emotions that come up. So it's almost like, metacognition, or labeling primary experience, trying to label that in a more adaptive way. So feeling like this, or feeling outside our comfort zone, we could label that in a negative way, or we could label that in a way, this is the place where I learn. Or if my comfort zone's like this, when I'm outside that, it might not feel great, but ultimately that's how my comfort zone gets bigger. There's an example that Tony Robbins gives. I don't know if I've got a chance to mention it briefly. So essentially, and again, it's how we interpret things. I believe he was talking about two different singers, Bruce Springsteen, and I think the other one was Mariah Carey. And he said, and he's spoken to both of them, and he said Bruce Springsteen, when he used to go on stage, he used to feel electricity going through his body. He used to feel his heart like it was going to beat out of his chest. He was struggling for his breath. And he said, and then I know I'm ready to perform. Mariah Carey described the very same symptoms. And then for her at that time, she was saying, and then I thought I thought something awful was going to happen with me medically, with my body. So it's the same. And then she got quite panicky and was unable to go on stage. So it's the same experiences, but how we label them is very, very important in terms of where our momentum goes. And getting better at the way we label struggle, not getting to where we want to, I think is a crucial underpinning of growth mindset, as also is getting in touch with meaning and self-compassion as sort of safety nets, if you like. Safety nets and drivers. The meaning is the driver. Self-compassion is kind of a safety net. And ultimately, if people are going to be hard on themselves, going back to the moments model, then it's better to be hard on ourselves about what we do in the next moment rather than what we did an hour ago, yesterday, last week, because those moments are gone, going back to the controllables.
That's really brilliant. Thank you, David. So I'm just really aware of time at the moment, actually.
Sure.
Unfortunately, we're coming to the end now, but many thanks for all of your contributions. I hope everyone listening found the discussion helpful. I'd like to take the opportunity. Sorry, I don't know what my computer's doing there. I'd just like to take the opportunity to highlight how critical thinkers can help support you and your school. We've designed a suite of awards that help students with the development of skills which are transferable to the world of 21st century work, and as well as becoming better equipped with dealing with various stresses, as we mentioned today, and challenges we all face during our lifetimes. So our Bronze, Silver and Gold Award facilitates gathering students' evidence for portfolios, which explores critical thinking, worldview and emotional intelligence. And we're currently working, it's really very exciting actually, closely with a number of schools who are piloting Unit 1 from our Bronze Awards from September. But just wanted to say that our full awards will be available for schools to implement from January 2022. So in addition to these fantastic awards, we've also offered courses on related topics developed by experienced psychologists and education specialists, such as the wonderful people on our panel here today. And you can find details on our experts and their particular courses on our website. And in addition to the courses, we also offer accredited CPD that's fantastic for schools in subjects related to our course topic areas. So if you'd like further information, needless to say, on our awards and courses, please visit our website, and you can also join our community from the website to keep updated with our developments. And we also have other social platforms you can also join to keep updated. So, well, we've come to the end of the webinar. So thank you very much again for joining us. We would really appreciate your feedback on the webinar. So we'll be sending a link out to you all. And if you could complete the short feedback form, that would be wonderful. And we've also created a document with top tips covering the strategies and solutions mentioned here this afternoon, which will also be sent to you for your information. If you do think of questions when you finish, you're later having a cup of tea and thinking, oh my goodness, why didn't I ask that, sorry, please feel free to email us and we'll get back to you. Thank you very much.